Good afternoon, Dr. Jahre.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine. Thank you. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us on the show this afternoon. I'll introduce you to our audience. This is Dr. Jahre, an infectious disease specialist at St. Luke's Hospital. And you specialize specifically in bacterial infections and in vaccination. Is that correct?
Well, it's the whole gamut of infectious diseases. So obviously it includes those areas as well as many others.
So you must have seen some serious stuff in your line of work.
Yeah, it ranges as with many things, from things that are very benign to things that are deadly serious.
And how would you say this pandemic ranks up against other experiences you've had?
Well, when you start to compare it to some of the pandemics that your audience might be familiar with, that have occurred literally within the last 40, 50 years, the only other pandemic really that I think has come close is the AIDS pandemic in terms of its impact. And certainly this has had a much more intense short-term impact, and it continues to.
And I guess the big difference is that there was no vaccine developed for AIDS and HIV.
That's correct. And that's a very important point that I'm sure we'll be stressing throughout this podcast, that we have the ability to make a major inroad here. And that is truly taking the vaccinations. And the vaccinations, I want to repeat, have been highly, highly effective in preventing the most serious sequelae, the most serious side effects of COVID-19, and that would mean hospitalization and certainly death.
So how does that make you feel then to see that the population is just about over 50% in vaccinated people?
Well, as with everything else, there's good news and there's bad news. So the good news is that the most vulnerable part of the population, which are the elderly, you're looking at acquisition rates there that are well over 80%, 80, 85% nationally. Now, it obviously drops down as we get down into a younger age group, and that includes the age group that I'm assuming that your podcast is being aimed to right now. And what is extraordinarily important to stress to people is that it can have a definite effect not only on them, but on those that they love and that surround them, and obviously it's society in general. So when you take into account all of those things, although there's no question that the most vulnerable population in general is this elderly population, and those with underlying disease, the population that you would be addressing right now, which is primarily, I'm assuming, the college age group, which is 18 to 24, is not immune from this. And just this last week, we've admitted 3 patients in their 20s to the hospital, all of which, I might add, are unvaccinated.
That's terrible to hear. Does the resistance to the vaccine surprise you? I mean, not the physical resistance, but the social resistance. Does that surprise you? Like moving through 2020 and the vaccines were being developed, did you anticipate that this cultural resistance would occur?
I think if you have a historical perspective, you have to anticipate this. The resistance to vaccines has been present ever since the original vaccination were brought forward, and a lot of that had to do with smallpox. There were all kinds of things that were attributed to not taking the smallpox vaccine, most of which obviously proved to be false. But it does hit home with a certain population. And what we're seeing is something very similar right now. And there are a lot of myths that have always surrounded vaccination, and that certainly surround the COVID-19 vaccines that exist to date.
Sure, and it's just so abundant on the internet and so easy to come across or to find you, even if you're not looking for it. The misinformation. Um, I think one kind of talking point that's going around is people will say, well, others are entitled to their opinion, whether they want to get it or not. How do you feel about a sentiment like that?
All right. Well, I'd like to try and put a certain perspective on that. And, you are up against the people who feel that they have a certain human right or individual right to do as they choose. And let me add some other things that might be familiar. Uh, for instance, you certainly have a right to drink alcohol as much as you want to. You do not have a right to drink alcohol and get behind the wheel of a car. Uh, you have the right, if you have an automobile license, to drive that automobile. And you do have a right to pick the kinds of tires that you want and the kinds of brakes that you want. However, there are standards that are put into place. And why are those standards into place? Not only to protect you as an individual, as a driver, but obviously because what you do behind that wheel will affect others if you get into an accident and you are driving under the influence, or if you're driving with inadequate brakes, or anything that would be a safety item that could affect other people. So the concept of our individual rights being subordinate to society is well established, and it has to do with many, many other things that I'm sure your audience can come up with. And that, by the way, should also include vaccinations for schools. And I think everyone here knows that to attend most schools and colleges, there are vaccinations that are indeed required.
So at our school, and this seems to be the trend with community colleges, not many 2-year schools seem to be requiring vaccination. The exception at Northampton Community College is dorming students. So if you're living on campus,
Yeah.
you have to show proof of vaccination, but you can exempt yourself due to medical, religious, or philosophical reasons. So that's the one that kind of gets me. It's like your philosophy. What does that really mean? If you're, I guess
All
you're
right, so let me kind of put that into perspective. By law, we really have to take into account people's religious and medical background whenever we advocate anything. And there are exceptions to every, and that's one of the issues when you make a broadened rule. There are going to be exceptions. Certainly, if someone has shown that they're majorly allergic to components of the vaccine, or they had a big reaction to one dose of a two-dose vaccine set, then clearly there's a medical exemption that should take place. There are occasional situations where you have to at least have a discussion, not necessarily that you have to be able to uh, say that that religious exemption holds. But there are some religions, some very fundamentalist religions, that are against all vaccination. So these things have to at least be discussed with individuals. I will tell you that the vast, vast majority of religions do advocate for getting the vaccine. And again, it has to do with your role in society in general. So what we do is we have the right to actually look at people's medical exemption to make sure that it isn't something that's just sort of passed through. There are certain medical exemptions that we would agree. There are certain situations that we might want to defer the vaccine. If someone's pregnant, as an example, it might be understandable that they might not want to have a vaccination until they deliver. So deferments in certain situations could be granted, but religious exemptions are really very, very few and far in between. And in most states right now, in a lot of states, the whole idea of philosophical objections has really been thrown out. And if you want to take one of the more liberal states where they ended up doing just that, you can look at California. And when they had their large measles outbreak, you may remember that it was related to some visitors to Disney World. Uh, they ended up getting that whole idea of philosophical objection thrown out through the legislature. So a lot of the more strict states, believe it or not, do not honor a philosophical objection.
Yeah, and I probably shouldn't do this, but I spend a lot of time reading the comments on various videos on YouTube and seeing what people have to say. And it seems like a lot of internet users are throwing around a lot of heavyweight terms and big ideas, and it doesn't seem like they're medical doctors. Can someone develop a solid understanding of medicine and vaccines and infectious diseases just by like studying WebMD and watching YouTube videos?
Well, as you know, when you try and look at source information, you have to actually really question the validity of the source. I have no doubt that if you wanted to, you would probably find some sources that would say that the Earth is flat, as an example. Um, and I'm not trying to be glib with some of these examples, or that Elvis is alive, that type of thing. You'll be able to find whatever your belief is. There's probably somebody out there that would add some credence to it. So the real question comes down to credibility and what are the actual arguments. And it's not even a question right now whether you'll find a medical doctor, because there are doctors that will not agree with some of the scientific evidence that is put forward. We do have a big tent in terms of differences of opinion on a number of different things, but you have to be able to look truly at where that's coming from and make your own informed decision. And so that's where we get into myths and some of the things that have been put out there on the internet that have been either exaggerated or there have been outright lies. So if you wish, I can start to go through some of those.
Sure, yeah, let's do it.
All right, so let me try and tackle these in some type of scenario. One of the things that you'll see out there is uh, that the CDC hasn't been totally honest, or the FDA or the medical establishment, that there have been thousands of people that have reported that have died after getting the COVID-19 vaccine. And therefore, obviously, that the COVID-19 vaccine is actually responsible for these deaths. Now, that is the second part of that is absolutely false. There is a system out there known as VAERS, which is a vaccine adverse reporting system that you can access or anybody else can access and can report into. So, for instance, if you get the COVID-19 vaccine and then 2 days later you fall and break your leg, you can report into that and say, I broke my leg, and therefore, after getting the COVID-19 vaccine. Um, and that's where the problem lies, that the COVID-19 vaccine has been given to something like, I think, 160 million people in this country, as an example. As everyone here knows, the major part of the population, as we already said, that got this vaccine initially was the most vulnerable. That would be the eldest part of our population, the nursing home population, and people who had underlying diseases. So there's no question that a certain number of those folks are going to die every day. If you're 80 years old or 90 years old, that there is a certain intrinsic death rate. So it doesn't, what the fact that you get the vaccine or one dose of the vaccine and then there's a death or there's a broken leg or there's a stroke, what you have to then put into the perspective is it outside of what would be expected normally for that age group? And that's where that breaks down. And that is not what's being said in these anti-vaccine forums. So when the CDC has looked at that right now, the answer is very clear that there isn't really an outsized death rate. In fact, quite the opposite. And there isn't an outsized stroke rate. There isn't, and I can go on and on and on. So the fact that someone actually has an issue after getting the vaccine, and the example that I always use is if you have a pet at home and you get up in the morning and you trip over your pet, which happens for to a lot of people, and you got the vaccine the day before. That does not mean that the vaccine made you trip over that pet. So That's why you have to be able to look at this and not just take these sort of sound bites that get exaggerated in there. And the other thing that is very often said is that this vaccine is totally experimental, and therefore no one really knows what the side effects are going to be because they're all so new. Well, again, let me give some basis for all of that. As you know, the most common vaccines that are out there are what's called mRNA vaccines, and they're made by either Pfizer or Moderna. They're two shots that are generally separated by either 3 or 4 weeks, depending on the maker. And one of the things that I don't think most people realize is mRNA, that whole issue of mRNA and how to make mRNA vaccines is not new. It's actually more than 30 years old. And what people don't realize is that patent on that is held by the University of Pennsylvania. That was where that was first developed. So the methodology is not a new concept whatsoever. The vaccine itself is relatively new. That, the COVID-19 vaccine, but not the methodology. So we do know a lot about that methodology. Secondly, we also know that most significant side effects of any vaccine, and this goes back to any vaccine from time immemorial, will show up in the first 2 months. And so what the FDA does is before they would even approve these vaccines for what's called an emergency usage authorization is they wanted 6 months worth of data to be present. And then they were granted an emergency usage authorization. And as everyone here knows, that we started to give those vaccines now roughly almost a year and a half ago. So we now have an additional year and a half's worth of data. So it isn't that we don't know what's going on. So if someone says, well, you don't know what's going to happen 20 years from now, yeah, there's some truth in that. But we also have to put that into a perspective, saying that when we look at all vaccines, the side effects that are important show up really within the first 2 months. And that these vaccines have been looked at in a much more careful manner than almost any vaccine that we've ever had in the past. So I think that your audience actually needs to keep that in mind. Secondly, whenever we do anything, and that applies to your audience, it applies to anything in medicine, you always have to weigh the benefits against the hazards. Again, if I could use the analogy of an automobile, every time you get into that automobile, there is a chance you're going to get into an accident that can be significant, that can be crippling, or in a certain percentage of cases, death. And we know that that's true even if you take all of the safety precautions in mind, that you're not driving in a snowstorm, you're wearing your seatbelt, your brakes are okay, and et cetera, et cetera. So does that mean that you don't get into your automobile? And the answer to that is that every time we do that, we make a conscious decision. Now, what we try and do is to not put the curve too much to the risk sense. So if there's a day where it's hailing and snowing and there's zero visibility, you're not going to get in that automobile unless you absolutely have to. And that would certainly be the case, or if it's slippery conditions, or you're not feeling well. But even so, you're making a conscious decision. And we do know one thing, that when you look at what the side effects are, the potential mortality of COVID-19 in every age group that you are talking about right now, it's clear that when you weigh that against any potential side effects of the vaccine, there's no comparison. There's no comparison. And that we also know that people who have very small symptoms or even asymptomatic disease with COVID-19, up to 30% of those individuals can have what's known as long haul symptoms. In other words, they have mental fog, they feel weakness, they just don't feel right. And that, they lose their sense of taste and smell. And that can sometimes be what seems to be almost permanent. It's there for a year to a year and a half since we've been tracking the vaccine. So again, I want to make it very clear that yes, there are some side effects related that we do know to the COVID-19 vaccine. You can have a fever, you can feel very weak, for a day or two afterwards. Some people have it for a little bit more of a long time. You can certainly have soreness on the at the site of injection, a headache. All of those, by and large, are transient. I mean, there every now and then you'll have a person who has a much more elaborate type or prolonged symptomatology. But it's rare, and when you compare that to the numbers of people who have COVID-19 who have permanent symptoms or crippling symptoms, there's no comparison.
Yeah, I guess some people who are resistant to the vaccine or resistant to taking the vaccine, they'll try to play a numbers game and say, well, you have this chance of survival if you get COVID. But that doesn't really work because anytime you measure up vaccinated versus unvaccinated, it's always going to make sense to be vaccinated. Is that correct?
Well, I think that you'll have to show me an example where it isn't in the over 18 age group. Now, there is some legitimate opinion right now when you're talking about ages 2 to 11 in particular. And I think that's yet to be worked out. Right now, we know that the side effects of the disease in that population are much, much lower. But when you're talking about the age group that you're involved with, college students, there's absolutely no comparison. As I've already said, we're admitting those folks to the hospital on a regular basis. And I think if you went around and spoke to your friends and family, that you'd find people that are in with your age group who've had much more in the way of severe symptoms with this, and who may still be suffering from that. So we're now at the point where everybody knows that. Now, some other myths. I mean, one of the myths is that the whole thing is a hoax, and how people can say that when we've had 1 million deaths, and God only knows how many people have been crippled and hospitalized. And I can take you through my hospital right now and show you. And at its peak, we had up to 350, within our 12 hospital system. But yet there are people who think that this whole thing is a hoax. And, again, all you can say is there are people who feel that landing on the moon was a hoax, that you have to be able to make these decisions based on the evidence that is there. Don't listen to some of the more extreme sites. Look around, talk to people, and you'll find out very quickly that it's very rare right now that you can talk to anybody who doesn't know someone in their family or someone in their who's a friend who hasn't had some aspect of COVID-19. And that would be my challenge to you. And if you still believe it's a hoax, then you'd have to be questioning what's really going on with all of those people. The other thing that people sometimes worry about is, that the way these vaccines are, it's going to get in and affect my DNA. No, it doesn't enter the nucleus. It doesn't do that. It doesn't do that at all. So, again, if you're scientifically, uh, if you have a scientific background and you want to look at the mechanism of mRNA vaccines in particular, you can take a look at that. You can see that, yes, there are things that it will do in terms of your cells, but it does, which it's supposed to do, in order to make you fight the disease. But it doesn't get into the basic constituency of your own of your own DNA or RNA. So it's not going to change you forever. There is no tracking system in this. I mean, again, I can't tell you how many people believe that somehow or other there is some kind of microchip that's embedded in this, and that there's a way that the government or some government or agency can now track every one of your movements. Well, again, there's all I can tell you is that there's absolutely no evidence to that, and you just pointed out exactly what I was going to say. You already have a tracking system, and that's your cell phone, and which is a far more effective way of tracking people if they want to. And there are many people out there, that in your age group who are more facile with that than I'll ever be. So if you're worried about tracking, I'd worry about your cell phone. I wouldn't be worried about the vaccine where there's no evidence of that whatsoever.
Would it even be possible to accomplish that, to administer a microchip through a liquid in a syringe? Is that
God only knows. I wouldn't know how that could, how that could be done. I mean, there are things that can happen, that can enter into your cells and change your cells. We know that. I mean, carcinogens can do that. But, not vaccines. So the important thing over here is that that's not what's going on. And when you start to look at these sites that have these more extremist views, there's no validity to that whatsoever. The other thing is, that it's absolutely going to affect my fertility, whether you're a male or a female. And here again, it's been endorsed by every society in medicine that deals with this, both male and female. And it's quite the opposite, in fact. I mean, there's a whole system right now that we view people who've gotten pregnant and who had free and clear pregnancies who already gotten the vaccine. And so that's not an issue whatsoever. So what I'm trying to get across is that when you make your about this, try and do it in a logical way. Um, it's not just because I'm telling you. I'd like you to do your own research and look into the pros and cons. And I think if you look into the pros, you would absolutely come out with the same conclusion that there is no good reason at this point in time, particularly when we now have another surge that's ongoing. And that's a fact of life. The Delta variant is here. We've already established that it has created a major issue right now. There's no reason for you not to get the vaccine. One other point, again, that I want to be very, very clear on. People are going to say, oh, well, look at all these people who have breakthrough infections. Look at what the CDC is saying. If you get the vaccine, it really doesn't protect you. So again, they're not looking at the total evidence. None of these vaccines were ever said to be 100% in protecting you from getting infected, or for that matter, getting you having lost the ability to actually transmit the infection. And so even when you want to look at our breakthrough infections, and this is what I think is particularly important, if you look at the number of people who have been vaccinated and all of the breakthrough infections that we've been able to classify to date, I believe it's 0.08%. And then when you want to look at what's happening to those people with the breakthrough infections, by and large, they're not being admitted to the hospital and they're not dying. The number of people who have been fully vaccinated who have died from this COVID-19 infection is 0.0001. And so, again, can you get COVID-19 if you've been vaccinated? The answer is, unfortunately, yes. Is it common? No, but it certainly happens. And, I think you've all recently heard cases of some famous athlete or commerce person that's had it. By and large, they have mild or moderate symptoms. They're not ending up in the hospital, and they are absolutely not ending up in the morgue. And so that's what the important thing is. We also know that your ability to transmit the disease, even though it can still be present if you have a breakthrough infection, is markedly less than it would be if you had the infection in an unvaccinated person. So again, for yourself, for your loved ones, for society in general, I'm actually imploring you to get vaccinated.
And do you think it's safe then, as a vaccinated person, to be in the classroom without a mask?
So when we get into masking, that tends to be a somewhat different debate, and there are some valid issues on both sides of the coin. So what we're trying to say, in general, at least, the CDC came out with this statement back in, it may have been June the 8th, that if you're vaccinated, you don't have to worry. You can live life as normal. They did that in an effort to try and encourage people, obviously, to get vaccinated almost as a gift. It turned out that was probably a premature statement to make, because the Delta variant had also been creating chaos at that time in Great Britain and in India, and we knew that it was already here and that it would likely do the same here, and it did. So by and large, although the statement is generally true, there are always nuances to that. So here's what I would tell you, that if you're vaccinated, and you're with a group of people who are otherwise healthy who have been also vaccinated, probably the idea of a mask becomes much less important. If you're outdoors, it certainly loses its importance because the ability to transmit it outdoors is far less. But if you go into a public space and where you're not sure who's vaccinated and who's isn't, so you get into a crowded bar, as an example, uh, then I think you have to make your own decision because it's possible that you can still get a mild to moderate case of COVID. It may not hurt you, but you can potentially then transmit it if you live with your grandparents or visit your grandparents, or your parents are immunosuppressed, or you're immunosuppressed. You may not want to do that. You may want to wear a mask under those kind of circumstances. So I think that this has to be an individualized situation. And again, the good news is so far that the vaccines that we have so far will prevent you from having the most severe side effects of the disease, whether it's Delta or any other. Now, whether that'll hold up over time, we don't know, because we know that Delta is not the only variant that's out there. That's a major importance. There's Lambda, there's Gamma, and that these are continuing to mutate. And so one of the thoughts is the more people we get vaccinated, the less likely you're going to have a population of massive amounts of virus that are continuing to mutate that might cause more problems later on.
One last question. One thing that the skeptics will say is, if these vaccines are safe, then why do the manufacturers have a liability from a liability protection? Like, so you couldn't sue them if something
Well,
happened.
one of the issues, because people think that vaccines are a very, very, very high profit area. And I'm not talking about the COVID-19 vaccine, but if you look back, if you and there are some of your folks that are business majors, and so go back 30 years or 40 years ago and see how many manufacturers that we had in the United States that made vaccines. And it was, I'm using some figures that may be way off, but it's the general proportion. There might have been 30 vaccine makers making vaccines. And why is it now down to literally a handful or less? Number one, because they're not that profitable, and they can't be. And number two, because anytime you give anything out to millions of people, you're going to have some people who may have an effect and then blame it on the vaccine, and you've got to then go defend that, which is an extremely expensive proposition. So, I mean, I can give you many different examples of manufacturers of other medical devices and things that have had to leave the market only because there were so many lawsuits that were involved, even though there was no scientific validity behind it. So what the government then ended up doing, if we were going to have anybody make any vaccines at all, is to try and give a certain liability umbrella. Otherwise, you and I wouldn't be able to get many of the vaccines that already exist, because in a commercial market, makers are not going to do something that's going to really cost them. So, and that's something to keep in mind with the COVID-19 vaccines as well. Secondly, some people would say, well, if it's really so great, why is it still under an emergency usage authorization? And again, one of the reasons why is that they want to be extra careful in terms, particularly not so much in the safety right now. I think that's pretty much an established fact, but in the durability of the vaccine. And there's a real question right now is, should you, if you had the vaccine more than 6 months ago, get a booster? Is it durable in every age group? And those are some of the questions that they want to answer. Plus, they also have to authorize manufacturing facilities when they remove that EUA. So we do expect that emergency use authorization will be removed. Uh, I'm hopeful that it would be in the next couple of months, and that will lead to full licensure and will remove that aspect of people who are thinking, oh my God, if it was such a terrific thing, why is it still under an emergency uses authorization? But there are a lot of factors that go into removing that have really very little to do with safety and more terms of durability and manufacturing.
Well, hopefully at that point they won't just come up with a new excuse as to why they
Well,
want.
I do think there are some people that would help them make the decision. It also, I mean, what you're seeing right now, with or without that EUA being removed, there are more and more employers that are demanding vaccination. There are more and more schools and universities, as you've already alluded to. I think the last time I looked, there's something like 600 now colleges and universities that are telling you that if you want to be present on campus, you got to be vaccinated. You may have read just the other day that if you want to attend a play in New York, you've got to show signs of vaccination. If you want to work for a number of different employers and be present, you're going to have to show signs of vaccination. I can tell you virtually every hospital is going to end up requiring it of healthcare workers, and we've already indicated that we will, EUA notwithstanding. So, this is, it's a fact of life, and uh, it's based on scientific evidence. We know that this is our best effort in protecting you and protecting those around you.
Well, thank you so much. That really helps. I think this will help to quiet the
Yeah,
mind.
and we're happy to try and, as you know, we've been assisting your university in helping to make some decisions. And if you come up with a bunch of questions that people have that are specific and you then funnel them into us, we will try and get you some specific answers to that. The one thing that I will say, though, is that for everyone to keep in mind, this pandemic is rapidly moving. Uh, it is truly, when they say it's a novel coronavirus, it is. And it has shown many abilities to surprise us. Usually those surprises have not been good. So right now we're going through a surge, as you've already pointed out. Northampton County, in fact, is the highest county in terms of case per population, I believe, in the state. At least it was as of a couple of days ago. And it's certainly very close to all the surrounding counties. Now, is that going to be the case in 2 or 3 weeks? Well, I don't know. So we're not prophets. We can talk about the safety of the vaccine based on the evidence that we have so far, but actually predicting what's going to happen with this pandemic is fraught with all kinds of potential issues. So when we tell you what we think might happen, we always put a disclaimer in that time will tell, and that we do reserve the ability to change our mind, because this pandemic could be a lot worse in a few weeks, or it could be a lot better. And I think time will tell, and we're going to be watching it closely.
Let's hope it gets better, and
I do indeed. I'm with you.
we'll keep our ear to the hallway floor and see what the buzz is, and if there are more questions from the students and other people on campus, maybe we could do this again and just help, get more people vaccinated.
We're happy to do that, Chris.
Okay, thank you so much for your time, Dr. Jerry.
And you as well, and your audience. Take care.